The foundation of experimental psychology is built on determinism. Today, that could either be biological determinism in the form of neurotransmitters, brain structures, or genetics, or social determinism, environmental determinism, which is the world we live in, the circumstances we grow up in, the parenting styles. Well, there's an alternative to this experimental empirical psychology, and it's called existential phenomenological psychology. This week on the Dr. Joby podcast, we're going to explore existential psychology and its implications in the 21st century. Perhaps the best-known existential psychologist today is the American Irvin Yalom. Yalom is an author and teacher and psychotherapist who concentrates on four main principles of existential psychology. And these, Yalom and the other existential psychologists believe, are the essential issues that human beings must come to terms with in order to live a healthful, fully engaged, creative life. And that is the inevitability of death, freedom and responsibility, the fact of existential isolation, and also our confrontation with meaninglessness. Before we turn to Yalom, let's look at Ludwig Binswanger, who lived from 1881 to 1966. Binswanger was one of the first existential psychologists. Binswanger was a psychoanalyst, initially drawn to the writings of Freud. He studied under Carl Jung and was also a student at the University of Zurich under Eugene Bleuler. Bleuler was the individual who coined the term schizophrenia. Binswanger's intention was to combine existential theory of Martin Heidegger, with psychoanalysis. In fact, Binswanger referred to his new form of therapy, which we would now discuss as existential psychotherapy or existential psychology, as Dasein analysis. And if you recall, this is from the Heideggerian term Dasein. Like his teacher Carl Jung, Binswanger felt that the individual's subjective world, it was the most important world for the individual. It was much more important to understand the internal world than the external world. The external world of reality might result in interesting facts and information, but it was really quite useless to the existential issues of the individual as they experienced them in their own internal subjective world. This, for Binswanger, was really the goal of therapy, to understand the particular person's anxieties and fears, values, thought processes, their social relations, and the meanings that they come to develop with the world. We see here already a distinction between scientific psychology and existential psychology. Scientific psychology sees the possibility of an objective reality. Existential psychology is interested in what might be called the subjective reality, due to the fact that many of the existential psychologists, including Heidegger in his writing, distance themselves from the idea of a subject and an object, that this is in itself a subjective experience. We look at the idea of the Dasein, the being here, being with, the being in. Binswanger proposed that human beings experience the world in three different ways. He called these three different modes of existence the Umwelt, the Mitwelt, and the Eigenwelt. Now, the Umwelt is the around world, the world of things and events. These are the things that surround an individual, their Umwelt. Their Mitwelt is the with world. These are interactions with other human beings. So we have the Umwelt, which are the things around us, the Mitwelt, which are our interaction with those things, and the Eigenwelt is the own world, and that's one's own personal and private and inner subjective experience. The Umwelt, the Mitwelt, and the Eigenwelt, the three modes of existence. Another concept that Binswanger speaks of was also discussed by Freud and Jung, and that is the Weltanschauung, or the world design, the worldview. Existential psychologists, like the psychoanalysts before them, describe the Weltanschauung as the window of our world, of our existence. This is, some individuals have simple worldviews and others have more complex worldviews. Some are positive, some are negative. We might even begin to approach this in contemporary cognitive terms as cognitive framing. Heidegger referred to this as the grounding, the Gestell, the Gestalt, the grounding that gives rise to our experience. Like Heidegger, Binswanger felt that the fact that the thrownness we're thrown into the world puts certain limitations on our free will, our personal freedom. And it is this thrownness, these circumstances that we are thrown into, that sets the ground of existence, this condition under which we exercise our personal freedoms, our free will. Binswanger, like Heidegger, felt that we are seeking to be beyond the world. We seek what is known as being beyond the world. In other words, we want to transcend the limitations, either biological or social, cultural, or personal limitations. We seek to transcend these. And this is the concept of being beyond the world. Being beyond the world is the ultimate act of free will. Free will, of course, is in direct contradiction to the project of science, which is seeking to find lawful, determined relationships in the physical world. The point here that Binswanger arrives at is expressed very succinctly in Viktor Frankl's text, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's the idea that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning. What's important for the existential psychologists here is that we maintain a sense of free will over determinism, that we take our circumstances and we create meaning in our circumstances. We decide through free will, through the act of non-determinism, to define the terms in which we're living. The very act of choice, the very act of saying, I choose to, or I choose not to, results in the existential freedom, in the redefining of the meaning of our circumstances. Listen to this quote from Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The very act of choice redefines the circumstances within which we are living. Two other names are very involved in the concept of Dasein analysis, the attempt to combine Heideggerian philosophy with psychoanalysis, and that would be Karl Jaspers, who lived from 1883 to 1969, as well as Medard Boss, who lived from 1903 to 1990. Perhaps the greatest popularizer of existential psychotherapy was the American Rollo May, who lived from 1909 to 1994. May had studied in seminary. He was a theologist. He also was the first individual to receive a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Columbia University. And he wrote a number of very informed books that introduced the ideas of existential psychotherapy to the American public. One of the most useful books that I've encountered of May's is The Courage to Create, which explores the act of creation and the fear and anxiety that one experiences when creating. May really did embrace Kierkegaard, which was Christian existentialism, and more spiritual existentialism. And he rejected Hegel's idea of the absolute, the idea that there was a general absolute defining gestalt that gave us meaning within our systems. May was interested in understanding individual, more like a Weltanschauung, an individual framing of existence. For May, the paradox of human existence he expressed as the human dilemma, and that's the idea that we can be both subjects and objects simultaneously. For May, like Heidegger, describing the ontic and the ontological, science understood human beings in one of those two aspects, which was the object, as an object that has experiences. May said there's another part of the human experience that is beyond being an object, that is being a subject, that is one who participates in the experiences and the meaning-making of those experiences. So this, of course, is one of the criticisms of taking the objective scientific view of human beings. This might be okay for existential psychologists when you're talking about minerals and plant forms, but to discuss human beings as merely objects is a shortcoming of science. Now, in that text, The Courage to Create, May really takes us to confront the anxiety that exists in the act of creativity. Creativity is something that we expose ourselves, we take risks, we attempt to move beyond what we were to create something new. This is the idea of exercising one's own freedom to choose beyond what one was in their past, ignoring what other people's expectations are, and even coming to terms with social conventions and social pressures. This is the idea of freedom, and it takes great courage to act on this freedom. And this conflict causes anxiety, but this is a normal, healthful anxiety that spurs us on. There's also a fear of freedom, which is later discussed by Erich Fromm. And this is the idea that when we are confronted with the freedom to do whatever we put our minds to do, whatever we choose to do, the very act of freedom is very scary. There's anxiety involved in this, and sometimes we do things to limit our freedoms. This is what May referred to as neurotic anxiety. And this is the type of anxiety that shuts us down, that keeps us from taking chances, and it turns us towards dogma, towards the security of things like dogmatic, fanatical belief in some system that's outside of ourselves, or patriotism, excessive patriotism, or any type of club membership. This is bad faith. This is sacrificing one's own freedom for the security that comes from submission. This is really expressed by Kierkegaard in self-alienation and a shut-off, what he called a shut-upness, a shut-offness from himself or herself, and really defining oneself through the symbols and rules and mores of some other group. And this can also even be seen in contemporary fandom with certain media, television, and movies, certain fanatical or fandom-based behaviors, as well as the typical sports fan fanatical behavior of identifying with any sort of group or team or political organization. One loses themselves and thus surrenders their own personal responsibility and freedom for the sake of the identification, the external identification with the group. One of the best illustrations of this is Erich Fromm's text, Escape from Freedom. For May and the other existentialists, this is really a confrontation with the need to feel safe and cling to the protection of parents or parental substitutes, or the ability to grow up, to engage and enlarge their self-awareness, their maturity, their freedom, and their responsibility, and stand on their own 2 feet with no excuses. Now, for May, it was important for the individual to have myth in their life. Myth, story, narrative. He said, myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narratives, patterns that give significance to our existence. What we see here in myth making is the act of artistry, of writing a story, of creating a film, of writing a book or a play, such as Samuel Beckett, or what Yalom does in his existential writings, of painting, of photography, whatever this is the act of creation, of creating myth that gives meaning to one's life. May develop something called narrative therapy, which examines the myths, the stories of an individual's life, and helps them to come to terms with and understand what that meaning, what grounding that meaning gives for their choices in life, for their decisions, and for how they live their life. And through creating of the myth, the individual comes to terms with the daimonic. This is the daimonic is that which is the impetus for all great art and literature and drama. Listen to how May defines the daimonic. Any natural function which has the power to take over the whole person. Sex and eros, anger and rage, and the craving for power are examples. The daimonic can be either creative or destructive, and normally both. The daimonic is the urge in every being to affirm itself, assert itself, perpetuate and increase itself. The daimonic becomes evil when it usurps the total personality without regard to the integration of the self, or to the unique forms and desires of others and their need for integration. It then appears excessive, as in aggression, hostility, cruelty, the things about ourselves which horrify us most, and which we repress whenever we can, or more likely project onto others. But these are the reverse side of the same assertion which empowers our creativity. All life is a flux between these two aspects of the daimonic. The word daimonic comes from the Latin daimon, which means the spirit. So this is the spiritual force. The daimonic is the spiritual force that pushes us towards what then can become good or evil. And for May, the nature of human beings is not ultimately good, nor is it ultimately evil. It is something that is much more complex. That's the dilemma that lives within all of us who are capable of good and evil simultaneously. To have a sense of identity, to have a sense of worth, of purposefulness in existence, those four issues that Yalom described as being at the core of existential psychology: meaningfulness, responsibility, the limitations of our existence, our impermanence, our mortality, and our free will. This, for May, are the very questions that we must come to terms with in our myths, our personal myth of living. We find these myths in various ways, through science, through religion, through art, but it is our personal responsibility to create ourselves. This is one of the defining aspects of existential psychology. One does not find themselves. One creates themselves. Now, for May, the natural sciences were one of multiple myths, multiple possibilities of myths. And especially now we see a great embracing of understanding the human condition only through neuroscientific or biological terms, the deterministic reductionism of materialistic philosophy. May and other existential psychologists didn't say this should be completely avoided. He said the mistake occurs when this becomes the fanaticized answer to the entire human condition. For May, for Fromm, for the other existentialists, the moment that we begin to see ourselves as reducible, mechanized machines that can be reduced to material substance, what William James referred to as nothing but psychology, love, affection, attachment as oxytocin, etc., then we're doing nothing but psychology. We're just doing a very shallow, one-dimensional analysis of the human condition, which will run its course. It's very appealing. It seems to have some sort of legitimacy because it works in understanding other aspects of nature. However, when it comes to the human condition, for the existentialists, this is just part of the story. And by only focusing or only giving legitimacy to that half of the story, we're neglecting the most important aspects of being human, the most important aspects of existence. In May's own words, the outlines of a science of man, we suggest, will deal with a man as the symbol maker, the reasoner, the historical mammal, who can participate in his community and who possesses the potentiality of freedom and ethical action. The pursuits of this science will take no less rigorous thought and wholeheartedness discipline than the pursuit of experimental and natural science at their best, but it will place the scientific enterprise in a broader context. Perhaps it will again be possible to study man scientifically and still see him whole. Thanks for listening to the Dr. Joby podcast. See you next week.